It began with a man who seemed to have everything under control. Blair Adams, a 31-year-old from British Columbia, Canada, was the kind of person who didn't stand out, at least, not in a way that hinted at danger. He was known to be kind-hearted, hard-working, and dependable. To those around him, Blair's life seemed stable. He had no enemies, no shady dealings, and no apparent reason to fear for his safety. But beneath the surface, something was unraveling. In the weeks leading up to his death, Blair began acting strangely, and those closest to him couldn't understand why. He started talking about feeling unsafe, convinced that someone or something was out to get him. His fears were so vivid, so intense, that they consumed him. What could push a man from a quiet, routine existence into a spiral of paranoia so severe that he would leave his home, his job, and everything he knew? As Blair embarked on a frantic journey across countries, his life would take a dark turn that no one could have predicted. What was chasing Blair Adams, or was it all in his mind? One thing is clear. His story ends in a parking lot, his body battered, his life savings scattered around him, and no one to explain what happened. The question remains, who or what killed Blair Adams? Blair Adams had always been level headed, a man who thrived on routine and the comfort of a predictable life. But in the days leading up to his death, something changed. Friends and family started noticing his behavior wasn't just odd, it was unsettling. Blair began making cryptic remarks, claiming his life was in danger. He told his mother, his coworkers, anyone who would listen, that he was being watched. Someone was after him, he said, but he couldn't or wouldn't explain who or why. When pressed for details, he grew visibly agitated, brushing off questions with vague responses. At work, Blair's paranoia began to seep into his daily tasks. He was distracted, jumping at shadows and looking over his shoulder as if expecting an unseen threat to materialize. The calm, composed man they knew was now a nervous wreck, consumed by fear that only he seemed to understand. The people closest to Blair were left bewildered. Was this some kind of misunderstanding, a phase he would snap out of? Or had Blair uncovered something so dangerous that it made him a target? Whatever the reason, his unease soon escalated into something far more alarming, a desperate need to escape. What was Blair running from? Was it a real, tangible threat, or was his paranoia born from something deeper, something buried within his own mind? These questions would haunt those left behind, as Blair's actions over the next few days became more erratic and infinitely more puzzling. Blair Adams had always been careful with his money. For years, he had worked hard, saving diligently, ensuring he had a financial cushion for his future. But suddenly, in a move that shocked everyone who knew him, Blair emptied his bank accounts. Every penny of his life savings, thousands of dollars in cash, gold coins, and other valuables, was withdrawn, packed into a small bag, and carried with him like an anchor to his unraveling sanity. It wasn't just the money. Blair's actions seemed frantic, almost reckless, as if time was running out. He didn't explain his decision to anyone, leaving friends and family to wonder, what was he preparing for? Why would a man with no known debts, no criminal entanglements, and no outward signs of trouble decide to abandon everything he had worked for? As he stepped out of the bank, clutching his life savings, Blair appeared to be a man on the run. But from what? Was he fleeing from a very real threat, something that had forced him to uproot his life overnight? Or was this part of a deeper spiral, an irrational response to fears only he could see? Whatever the reason, This sudden and drastic withdrawal was the first concrete step in Blair's path toward tragedy. With his life savings in hand, he left behind his home, his job, and his normalcy, heading into the unknown. It was a decision that would forever blur the line between reality and mystery. Blair Adams's journey was anything but straightforward. It was chaotic, scattered with abrupt decisions that painted a picture of a man either running from a threat or racing towards something he couldn't articulate. First, he purchased a plane ticket to Germany, a destination that seemed to have no connection to his life. But hours later, he canceled the ticket without explanation. Then, as if trying to outpace an invisible pursuer, he boarded a ferry from Victoria to Vancouver, only to turn around and head back the same day. His movements became more erratic with each passing hour. He rented cars only to return them shortly after. He traveled aimlessly between cities, zigzagging across the region with no clear destination. Each choice seemed increasingly irrational, leaving those who pieced together his trail baffled. Finally, he made an impulsive decision that would alter the course of his journey, crossing the border into the United States. But even then, his behavior raised eyebrows. Border agents noted Blair's nervous demeanor, the way he struggled to explain why he was entering the country. He had large amounts of cash on him, but no clear plan, no obvious purpose for his travels. As Blair crisscrossed between airports and rental car desks, his erratic actions begged the question: was he running from someone, a shadowy pursuer he was too terrified to name? Or was he chasing something, a solution, a safe haven, or perhaps a sense of peace that remained just out of reach? One thing is clear: whatever Blair Adams was searching for, time was running out. His frantic movements were leading him down a path he couldn't escape, and neither could the danger closing in on him. When Blair Adams finally reached the United States, his behavior became even harder to ignore. Crossing the border from Canada into the US, his arrival was anything but ordinary. Border agents were immediately struck by his demeanor. He was visibly nervous, fidgeting, and struggling to answer even the most basic questions about his travel plans. His explanation for entering the US was fragmented and unclear. He spoke in circles, offering no concrete details about where he was going or why. What stood out even more was what he carried with him: a mix of Canadian dollars, US currency, and gold coins, all stuffed into his belongings. Agents couldn't help but wonder why a man would cross the border with such a peculiar assortment of wealth, but no clear destination. Despite the strange circumstances, Blair was allowed through, but his jittery behavior lingered in the minds of those who encountered him. What could make a man act so erratically, as though every second was a step closer to danger? Theories swirl. Was Blair truly running from someone, a threat so real that it forced him to cross international borders in desperation? Or was this paranoia, a battle within his own mind that was spiraling out of control? As Blair stepped into the United States, he didn't seem to find the relief he might have been seeking. Instead, the journey ahead only grew darker, more puzzling, and ultimately more tragic. What was chasing Blair Adams, or was he running from something far more personal, something he couldn't escape no matter where he went? Blair Adams's frantic journey took him far from the familiar landscapes of British Columbia, leading him to a city that seemed as random as his every move: Knoxville, Tennessee. Why Knoxville? That's the question investigators and anyone following Blair's mysterious case have struggled to answer. Blair arrived in Knoxville alone, weary from days of erratic travel, but no less paranoid. Witnesses later reported that his anxiety was palpable, as if whatever he was fleeing had followed him across borders and miles. He checked into a local hotel, a modest establishment that provided no clues as to why he had chosen this particular destination. What makes this stop even more puzzling is the lack of any clear connection between Blair and Knoxville. He had no family there, no friends, no business ties, nothing that would explain why this city had become the final stop in his journey. Did Knoxville hold some significance that only Blair understood, or was it simply where the road ended when his panic overtook him? As Blair stepped into that hotel, his behavior continued to raise questions. Why Knoxville? Why a place so far from anything and anyone he knew? The answer to that question remains one of the most haunting aspects of his story, one that leaves us wondering, was he seeking safety, or had his pursuer real or imagined driven him here to meet his fate? This was not just a detour. Knoxville would be the final chapter in Blair Adams's mysterious and tragic journey. Blair Adams's arrival at the Knoxville hotel seemed routine at first. He checked in, interacted briefly with the front desk staff, and received a key to his room. But what happened next only deepened the mystery surrounding his final hours. Minutes after leaving the lobby, Blair returned to the desk, visibly unsettled. He claimed his room key wasn't working, though the staff later confirmed there were no issues with it. Employees noted that Blair appeared out of it, as if distracted by something only he could see. His movements were jittery, his gaze constantly darting toward the lobby doors. Was Blair imagining danger just outside those doors? Or was there someone watching him, someone who had followed him to Knoxville? His agitation suggested a man teetering on the edge of a breakdown, consumed by paranoia. But was this paranoia rooted in reality? Hotel staff couldn't help but feel uneasy around him. Despite their efforts to assist, Blair remained anxious and preoccupied, his behavior defying explanation. He seemed almost reluctant to go to his room, as if fearing what or who might be waiting for him. This brief yet strange encounter was one of the last times Blair Adams was seen alive. Whatever was troubling him, it was escalating and fast. The question remains, was Blair Adams losing his grip on reality, or was his fear a desperate, final attempt to escape something or someone that was closing in on him? The final night of Blair Adams's life was shrouded in tension and mystery. Far from home, with no one to turn to, he seemed to drift aimlessly around the Knoxville hotel where he had checked in earlier. His restless movements painted the picture of a man on edge, desperate, isolated, and haunted by something no one else could see. Blair was spotted wandering around the hotel parking lot. Witnesses described him as visibly distressed, his behavior erratic. He seemed distracted, as if he were expecting or dreading someone's arrival. Alone under the dim lights of the lot, his unease was palpable. At some point, Blair left the hotel entirely, stepping out into the quiet Knoxville night. No one knows exactly where he went or why. Did he sense danger closing in on him, prompting him to leave in search of safety? Or was his frantic pacing the result of an inner turmoil he couldn't escape? The hotel staff later recalled Blair's behavior that night with a sense of foreboding. He seemed trapped in a battle between flight and fear, his actions frantic and devoid of any clear direction. Whatever was tormenting him, it was relentless. That night, Blair Adams vanished into the darkness. It would be the last time anyone saw him alive. Hours later, his body would be found in a nearby parking lot, lifeless and surrounded by unanswered questions. What happened in those final, fateful moments? And more importantly, was Blair running toward salvation or straight into the hands of his killer? The morning sun revealed a scene that would baffle investigators for decades. Blair Adams's body was discovered in a parking lot near a construction site, just a short distance from the hotel where he had spent his final hours. His death was as unsettling as his erratic journey, leaving more questions than answers. Blair's body lay partially clothed. His shirt had been ripped open, and his pants were removed, turned inside out, and discarded nearby. Surrounding him was a strange assortment of belongings, thousands of dollars in Canadian and American currency, scattered gold coins, jewelry, and a fanny pack filled with valuables, all untouched. There was no immediate sign of a struggle, no obvious weapon in sight. The cause of death would later be determined as blunt force trauma to his abdomen, but how or by whom it was inflicted remains a mystery. The scene was hauntingly quiet, devoid of any clear evidence pointing to what had transpired. To those who found him, it wasn't immediately obvious whether this was a murder, a robbery gone wrong, or something far stranger. Blair's belongings, which could have been a motive for theft, were left untouched. Police were left with a grim puzzle. Was this a carefully staged crime scene designed to mislead investigators? Or had Blair Adams's paranoid flight ended in a tragic accident, his fears overtaking his grasp on reality? One thing was certain: whatever had happened to Blair in the final hours of his life, it had culminated in this chilling discovery. And the answers, if they existed, were hidden within the clues scattered around him or buried in the moments leading up to his death. When Knoxville detectives arrived at the scene, they were met with a mystery that defied immediate explanation. Blair Adams's lifeless body lay partially undressed, surrounded by an array of valuables, a stark contrast to the typical motives behind a crime like this. The scattered cash, gold coins, and jewelry were untouched. Why would a killer leave behind such an enticing haul? The police were baffled. Could this have been a robbery gone wrong, ending in a struggle that spiraled out of control? Or was the presence of Blair's belongings a deliberate statement, a message left by his attacker? The evidence didn't fit neatly into any narrative. As detectives examined the scene, the scattered items hinted at a possible confrontation. Blair's clothing, disheveled and turned inside out, suggested a chaotic struggle. But with no weapon present and no signs of restraint or defensive wounds, the nature of the attack remained unclear. Investigators also had to consider Blair's mental state. Was this a tragic accident, perhaps a result of his own actions as he spiraled deeper into paranoia? Or was there an unknown attacker, someone who had followed Blair through his erratic journey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Theories began to take shape, but none provided a definitive answer. The unusual details surrounding Blair's death left detectives with more questions than answers, and the case was growing colder by the minute. One fact was certain: this was no ordinary crime scene, and solving it would require unraveling the intricate mystery of Blair Adams's final days. The autopsy report only deepened the mystery of Blair Adams's death. The coroner concluded that Blair had died from blunt force trauma to his abdomen, a devastating injury that ruptured his internal organs. Yet no weapon was found at the scene, no bat, no rock, nothing that could have caused such a fatal blow. This perplexing detail left investigators grasping at straws. The injury was violent and deliberate, but its nature was also oddly intimate. Blunt force trauma suggested a physical altercation, something personal and up close, rather than a distant, detached attack. Could this mean Blair knew his killer, or was the attack random, carried out in the heat of the moment by a stranger? Detectives couldn't rule out the possibility that Blair's death wasn't premeditated. The scattered belongings hinted at chaos, perhaps a sudden and explosive confrontation. But without a murder weapon or witnesses, every theory seemed to hit a dead end. Adding to the confusion was the absence of other injuries. Blair didn't appear to have defensive wounds, raising a chilling question. Did he even see the attack coming? Was he taken by surprise, or was he incapacitated in some way before the fatal blow? As you think about the possibilities, one unsettling reality comes to light. Whoever killed Blair Adams left behind no clear evidence of their presence. Was this the work of a calculated murderer, someone skilled enough to leave no trace? Or was this another layer of an already unfathomable mystery? The coroner's report closed one door, but opened countless others, forcing investigators and now us to consider what kind of person could inflict such violence and then vanish without a trace. Amid the confusion and tragedy of Blair Adams's death, one detail stood out as particularly baffling: the valuables scattered around his body. Cash, both Canadian and American, lay untouched, alongside gold coins and jewelry, some of which had been carefully stored in a fanny pack. In total, there was enough wealth to tempt any thief, yet it was all left behind. This one fact sent a wave of uncertainty through the investigation. If robbery wasn't the motive, then what was? Typically, crimes involving such violence stem from clear reasons: greed, anger, or revenge. But this scene defied logic. The valuables, so casually discarded, suggested the killer wasn't after material gain. Detectives began to consider the chilling possibility that this crime was deeply personal. Was Blair killed by someone with a grudge, someone who cared little for his possessions and more for silencing him? Or could his death have been the result of a random attack, one so chaotic that the perpetrator fled the scene in panic, leaving behind the evidence of their missed opportunity? The placement of the items also raised questions. Was the scene staged to confuse investigators? Or was this simply the aftermath of a struggle, with Blair's belongings spilling out in the chaos of his final moments? Think about this. What kind of killer walks away from cash and gold, leaving behind a fortune without a second thought? Does this point to someone who knew Blair personally, someone whose motives were rooted in emotions far darker than greed? Or does it hint at a deeper layer to this case, one that remains obscured by the unanswered questions surrounding his death? The untouched valuables add a haunting element to Blair Adams's story, one that forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that his death wasn't about what he had, it was about who he was and what he may have known. Blair Adams's mysterious death left investigators with a maze of theories, but no clear path to the truth. With no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, and no obvious motive, the case became a breeding ground for speculation. What really happened to Blair during those final, chaotic hours in Knoxville? One of the earliest theories suggested a random attack. Knoxville, like any city, had its share of dangers, and it wasn't impossible that Blair had encountered someone with violent intentions. But if this was a robbery, why leave behind cash, gold, and jewelry? And why attack Blair in such a strange and intimate way, inflicting blunt force trauma rather than using a weapon more common in random violence? Another theory focused on Blair's own mental state. Those close to him had noticed his growing paranoia in the days before his death. Could Blair have been experiencing a psychotic break? Some suggested that his erratic behavior, like withdrawing his life savings and crisscrossing borders, might have stemmed from a deep mental health crisis. If this were the case, it's possible he got into a confrontation that ended in his death, or perhaps he unknowingly placed himself in harm's way. But what if Blair's paranoia wasn't unfounded? What if he really was being followed? Some theorists believe Blair may have unknowingly stumbled into something sinister, a crime ring, or a dangerous secret, while back in Canada. Could he have crossed paths with the wrong people, setting off a chain of events that led to his frantic escape and untimely death? Then there's the possibility of a personal grudge. Could someone from Blair's past have followed him, waiting for the perfect moment to confront him? His erratic journey, the hotel incident, and the unexplained fear all point to a man desperate to stay ahead of something or someone. The lack of a clear motive is what makes this case so confounding. Every theory seems plausible, yet none fit perfectly. Was Blair Adams the victim of a random act of violence, a tragic accident born of his own unraveling mental state, or something far more calculated? One thing is certain: whatever happened to Blair, the answers remain buried in the shadows of his fractured journey and in the motives of whoever or whatever ended his life. Before his death, Blair Adams repeatedly told those around him one chilling thing: someone was trying to kill him. He didn't just hint at it, he declared it with conviction, as if his very survival depended on being believed. Friends, family, and coworkers all heard the same desperate warning, but none could make sense of what or who had driven him to such fear. Blair's mother later recalled how he seemed genuinely terrified, though he couldn't or wouldn't explain the details. He spoke in vague terms, avoiding specifics, as though revealing too much might hasten the danger he felt closing in. "They're after me," he reportedly said, but when pressed about who they were, his answers would dissolve into fragmented thoughts or silence. His coworkers noticed the change too. Blair, who had once been reliable and easygoing, now seemed on edge, watching his surroundings like a man expecting an ambush. The transformation was stark and unnerving. People who knew him wondered if he had fallen into some kind of trouble, or if he was struggling with fears that were entirely imagined. But what if Blair's fears weren't imaginary? Could he have stumbled upon something knowingly or unknowingly that put him in harm's way? His erratic behavior, though unsettling, might have been a response to a very real threat. Perhaps Blair was running from something too dangerous to confront, something that followed him across borders all the way to Knoxville. At the same time, there's the possibility that Blair's fear stemmed from within. Was he experiencing a mental health crisis that made him believe he was being hunted? If so, his frantic journey might have been a tragic attempt to escape a danger that only existed in his mind. Blair's repeated confessions of fear add another layer of complexity to this unsolved mystery. Were these the ramblings of a man unraveling under internal pressure, or the desperate warnings of someone who saw their fate coming before anyone else could? And if Blair truly was being hunted, who or what was he running from? One of the more perplexing aspects of Blair Adams's case is the possibility that his behavior in the days leading up to his death was rooted in an undiagnosed mental health condition. His paranoia, erratic decisions, and cryptic warnings have led some to speculate that Blair may have been experiencing a psychotic episode, perhaps brought on by stress, trauma, or an underlying disorder. Psychosis can cause a person to lose touch with reality, perceiving threats that don't exist or misinterpreting harmless events as dangerous. Blair's repeated claims that someone was trying to kill him, coupled with his sudden withdrawal of life savings and frantic journey, could fit this pattern. To those who knew him, it seemed as though Blair's sense of logic had unraveled, leaving him consumed by fear. Yet, certain details complicate this theory. Blair had no known history of mental illness. He wasn't on medication, hadn't exhibited such behavior before, and was described by friends and family as stable and grounded until shortly before his death. If this was a mental health crisis, what triggered it so suddenly and so severely? Furthermore, some aspects of his actions suggest purpose rather than disorientation. His careful withdrawal of cash and valuables, for example, seemed like preparation for a calculated escape. If Blair was truly experiencing psychosis, how do we explain the coherence in some of his decisions, such as ensuring he had access to funds? Another possibility is that a mental health condition, if present, may have been exacerbated by external factors, real dangers that Blair was unable to articulate fully. Could he have felt overwhelmed by genuine threats, his fear heightened by an undiagnosed issue? The theory of mental health challenges adds another layer to Blair's mysterious case. It raises the question of whether his tragic end was the result of a mind in turmoil, or if his fears, though seemingly irrational, were rooted in truths only Blair himself could see. Whatever the case, the mental health angle reminds us of the complexity of the human mind and its potential role in this unsolved mystery. The scene where Blair Adams's body was discovered was a puzzle in every sense, and it's the small, seemingly random details that continue to baffle investigators and fuel speculation. Each element seemed slightly out of place, as if the scene were a collection of clues meant to confuse rather than clarify. First, there was Blair's clothing. His pants were removed, turned inside out, and left discarded nearby. His shoes were off, placed some distance from his body, and his shirt had been torn open. These details raised an immediate question. Was this the result of a violent struggle, or did Blair remove these items himself during a moment of panic or confusion? Then there were his belongings. Cash, both Canadian and American, lay scattered around him, alongside gold coins and jewelry. These weren't tucked away or hidden, but strewn across the ground in plain sight. It was as though the items were dropped in haste or flung about during a chaotic confrontation. Yet none of it had been taken, ruling out robbery as an obvious motive. The positioning of Blair's body was another oddity. He was found lying on his back, his arm extended out as if reaching for something or someone. There were no obvious signs of restraint, and the lack of defensive wounds suggested he hadn't fought back, or perhaps that the fatal blow came too quickly for him to react. Adding to the mystery was the lack of physical evidence nearby. No weapon, no clear signs of a struggle in the dirt, no footprints or fingerprints, nothing to indicate how Blair had ended up in that spot or who might have been responsible. What do these odd details tell us? Could the disarray of Blair's clothing and belongings hint at a struggle with an unknown attacker? Or were they the actions of a man in a desperate, irrational state, trying to escape something only he could perceive? Each piece of this puzzle invites speculation. Was this the work of someone trying to stage a scene, deliberately leaving a trail of confusing evidence? Or was it the natural result of a chaotic series of events that ended in tragedy? As we analyze these small but significant details, It's clear that every element of this scene holds the potential to unlock the truth or to pull us deeper into the mystery of Blair Adams's untimely death. Determined to uncover the truth behind Blair Adams's death, investigators began retracing his chaotic route to Knoxville. Every detail of his journey, from his frantic movements in Canada to his arrival in Tennessee, was scrutinized. Detectives hoped to find anyone, who had encountered Blair in those final days, someone who might provide insight into the mystery. Blair's path was anything but straightforward. He had crossed international borders, rented cars, booked and canceled flights, and interacted with numerous people along the way. Yet, when investigators dug deeper, they found that most of those encounters led to dead ends. There was no evidence of anyone suspicious following Blair across his erratic route. No witnesses reported seeing anyone trailing him or acting suspiciously in his proximity. If someone was after him, they had covered their tracks remarkably well. Alternatively, if Blair was fleeing from imagined threats, his erratic movements made it nearly impossible to determine a clear pattern or motive. Still, detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that Blair's fears were grounded in reality. Was it possible that he had crossed paths with a stranger, someone dangerous, during his desperate attempt to escape? A single wrong encounter at a gas station, rest stop, or hotel could have set events in motion that led to his tragic end. Despite their efforts, investigators couldn't find any definitive evidence pointing to who or what Blair might have been running from. The trail to Knoxville grew colder with each passing day, leaving detectives and his family with a growing sense of frustration and despair. Faced with an unsettling lack of leads, authorities turned to the public for help. Press releases, interviews, and televised appeals for information urged anyone who had seen or interacted with Blair Adams to come forward. But the response was painfully underwhelming. Few witnesses could recall anything significant, and those who had interacted with Blair described him only as anxious and agitated. No one could explain why he had chosen Knoxville, nor could they shed light on the cryptic fears he had expressed in his final days. Blair's family, desperate for answers, held on to the hope that someone would step forward. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the silence only deepened their pain. Every potential lead seemed to evaporate upon closer inspection, leaving investigators with a case that refused to yield answers. For Blair's loved ones, the unanswered questions were unbearable. Who or what had driven him to such desperate measures? Had his death been the result of a cruel twist of fate, or was someone out there walking free, carrying the secret of his final moments? The lack of witnesses and the absence of clear evidence left detectives and Blair's family grappling with the same haunting realization. Without new information, Blair Adams's case might remain forever unsolved, another enigma lost to time. Throughout Blair Adams's erratic and tragic journey, one fear loomed larger than all others: the belief that someone was after him. Blair was adamant that a shadowy figure or figures were tracking his every move. But was this fear a product of his own unraveling mind, or was there truth behind his paranoia? Some theorize that Blair may have angered someone, perhaps unintentionally. Could he have crossed paths with the wrong person, a stranger, or an acquaintance who decided to make him a target? Or was this someone from his past, someone with a grudge strong enough to follow him across borders and cities, biding their time until the opportunity to strike arose? The lack of evidence for a stalker has led skeptics to argue that Blair's fears were rooted in a mental health crisis rather than a real threat. Yet, for others, the details of his case raise unsettling questions. His erratic movements, the scattered belongings, the blunt force trauma, could these be the work of someone skilled enough to cover their tracks, leaving no trace of their involvement? If there was a stalker, they remain as elusive as the answers to Blair's fate. Was this shadowy figure real, hiding in the margins of Blair's story, or were they a creation of his own mind, reflecting fears that grew too overwhelming to contain? What do you think? Was Blair Adams's paranoia justified? Could there have been someone following him, someone whose intentions were far darker than anyone imagined? Let us know your thoughts on this chilling possibility in the comments. Decades later, Blair Adams's case remains as mysterious as the day his body was discovered. His journey from British Columbia to Knoxville, his erratic behavior, and the unsettling details of the crime scene continue to baffle investigators and armchair detectives alike. Why did Blair believe he was being hunted? Was he fleeing from a very real danger, or was his mind betraying him in ways that led him down a path of no return? And what brought him to Knoxville, a city with no apparent connection to his life? Perhaps most haunting of all is the question of what happened in his final moments. Who or what inflicted the blunt force trauma that ended his life? And why leave behind cash, gold, and other valuables, as though the killer had no interest in robbery or material gain? The case of Blair Adams is a tapestry of unanswered questions, each thread pulling us deeper into its unsettling mystery. Was he the victim of a calculated attack, a tragic misunderstanding, or an unseen battle within his own mind? Now, it's your turn to weigh in. Could there be a piece of the puzzle that everyone has missed? Why did Blair Adams end up in Knoxville? And what, if anything, could have been done to prevent his tragic fate? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments, and let's keep the discussion alive. Blair Adams's story may remain unsolved, but it's far from forgotten. Together, maybe we can help shed light on this enduring enigma.